Hi, I'm Brian Rowe. I'm the environment correspondent for National Catholic Reporter and its Faith and Climate reporting project Earthbeat. It's great to be here at the Teach-In, even if it means that we have to meet this year by screen. So today we'll be talking about the 2020 presidential election and what it means for how the nation, and to an extent the world, addresses climate change in this all-important decade. I'll start by revisiting some of my reporting on why the next decade is so important for the climate, and then outline some of the stakes tied to the upcoming election. From there, we'll directly hear from some young Christian voters on how they are weighing climate change and environmental justice into their ballot, and how their faith is informing that decision. And finally, we'll wrap with an interview with Franciscan Fr Michael Lasky, board chair of the Franciscan Action Network, who will talk about some of the ways Catholics are engaging voters around climate change and environmental justice ahead of the election. During our time today, be sure to drop any questions, thoughts, comments you have for me in the chat. Since this is pre-recorded, I'll be there in the chat room too, and I'll be sharing some links to some of the stories that I've reported that are related to what we're talking about, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of the questions that you have too. First, let's start with a quick refresher on the state of the climate and why the 2020s are so important. We know the science tells us that the Earth is warming. So far, roughly 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s industrial period. And we know human activity, primarily burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, are the primary driving force behind that warming. According to NASA, the bulk of the warming has occurred in the past 40 years, so since the 1980s. 19 of the 20 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001, with 2016 being the warmest year on record. 2020, as you may remember, opened with massive wildfires in Australia. And this summer, Death Valley in California recorded one of the highest daily temperatures, 130 degrees Fahrenheit on record. As of now, 2020 is expected to rank in the top 5 warmest years and could challenge for the warmest year ever. The consequences of climate change are many. More frequent droughts and heat waves, more intense wildfires, more frequent extreme weather. And in nearly every case, these events impact the world's poor and vulnerable communities first and fiercest. That's a central reason why Catholics and other people of faith call climate change an urgent moral issue. That includes Pope Francis, who addressed it head-on 5 years ago in his encyclical Laudato Si. In that document, he wrote, "Climate change is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades." And then he shortly added, "Our lack of response to these tragedies involving our brothers and sisters points to the loss of that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which civil society is founded." So, what do we do about it? I was in Paris reporting in December 2015 when nations around the world adopted the Paris Agreement, which committed them to take actions nationally to limit global temperature rise between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Most of the focus in the time since has been on that 1.5 degree target, since the difference between the two could mean far much more human suffering. But so far, nations are not doing a good job of meeting that goal. Right now, warming is set to reach at least 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and that's only 80 years away. A 2018 UN report from top climate scientists stated that in order to have a chance to meet the 1.5 degrees target in the Paris Agreement, emissions must be cut nearly in half by 2030 and then brought to net zero by 2050. Pope Francis and the Vatican have been outspoken in their support of the Paris Agreement, and just as outspoken in criticizing governments and political leaders for not doing enough or acting quickly enough on climate change. This is what he said in January to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps, just before the coronavirus pandemic had begun to spread rapidly around the world. Sadly, the urgency of this ecological conversion seems not to have been grasped by international politics, where the response to the problems raised by global issues such as climate change remains very weak and a source of grave concern. And this brings us back to the US election. The outcome of the presidential election here will have significant consequences for how the country addresses climate change. A day after the election, November 4th, the US will officially withdraw from the Paris Agreement. President Trump had initiated that process back in 2017. Whether the U.S. remains outside that global climate pact or returns to it will likely hinge on who is elected. As you may know, Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden have contrasting views on climate change. Trump campaigned in 2016 on exiting the Paris Agreement and was able to start that process within his first year in office. But beyond exiting the Paris Agreement, the Trump administration has worked to roll back 100 environmental regulations. That's according to a tally kept by the New York Times and other organizations. 2/3 of those rollbacks have been completed, with the largest share of them dealing with pollution, including the weakening of emissions standards for vehicles and for coal-fired power plants. Trump has also worked to open public lands and offshore waters to oil and gas drilling, and gave green lights to both the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. He has summarized his environmental policies as prioritizing, quote, crystal clean water and air. And under his watch, the EPA has mostly focused its attention to cleaning up Superfund sites. This summer, the president did sign the bipartisan Great American Outdoors Act, which will pump billions of dollars into conservation efforts in our national parks. As for Joe Biden, he has promised to re-enter the U.S. into the Paris Agreement shortly after taking office. That process would take 30 days to complete. As for the rest of his environmental proposals, Biden has framed them mostly with two words: jobs and justice. On the jobs front, he has proposed spending $2 trillion over the next 4 years on clean energy, energy efficiency, and infrastructure projects toward eliminating carbon pollution from the nation's power sector by 2035 and shifting the U.S. economy to 100% clean energy and net zero greenhouse gas emissions no later than 2050. Biden has also put forward a number of environmental justice policies, which his campaign has consulted on with a number of groups, including the National Black Environmental Justice Network. He has said he would ensure 40% of the clean energy spending he's proposed would benefit disadvantaged communities. He has also proposed creating an environmental and climate justice division in the Department of Justice and creating screening tools to identify communities most at risk of climate change, pollution, and racial inequality. He has also said he would work to eliminate long-lasting pollution in low-income and indigenous communities. We heard pieces of both candidates' positions on climate change during the first presidential debate. President Trump at that debate called the Paris Agreement a disaster, and he also appeared to concede that human activities have contributed to some extent to global warming. These comments, though, came a couple of weeks after he met with officials in California who were battling the wildfires there, and he said that he wasn't sure that science knew what was happening with climate change and that eventually the planet would start cooling. For his part, Biden outlined his climate plans, and he also distanced himself from the Green New Deal, which he's called more of a framework than something that he fully endorses. So that's where the two presidential candidates stand on climate change. But what have Catholics been saying about the election and the environment? It's a good reminder at this point to say that Catholic parishes, dioceses, organizations, as nonprofit organizations, are barred from endorsing specific candidates. So it's no surprise that we haven't heard many bishops or priests speaking out for or against candidates. But they are able to talk about issues and policies, and that's something that they've done during the Trump administration, that they've done during previous presidential administrations as well. During this election cycle, we've seen at least two bishops address the environment specifically. One is San Diego Bishop Robert McElroy. In a September 25th column, he listed 10 gospel-centered goals that he saw for the 2020 election. Among them, the reversal of the climate change that threatens the future of humanity and particularly devastates the poor and the marginalized. McElroy added, "The impact of climate change threatens humanity itself if changes in global policies are not undertaken in the coming years." At the same time, he reminded Catholics, it is the candidate who is on the ballot, not a specific issue, and urged voters to also consider leadership, competence, and character as well. In February, McElroy hit on some of the same themes during a speech at the University of San Diego, including how Catholics should approach prioritizing issues, especially around abortion and climate change. He called both core life issues in Catholic teaching, and said the drive to label a single issue preeminent distorts the call to authentic discipleship and voting rather than advancing it. Another bishop who has spoken about how to consider environmental issues is Bishop John Stowe of Lexington, Kentucky. In September, he joined a Catholic Climate Covenant webinar on voting in Catholic social teaching. Like McElroy, Stowe said that Catholic social teaching discourages single-issue voting, and he urged Catholics to follow the idea of integral ecology that Francis outlines in Laudato Si, recognizing how many issues are interrelated with each other, and that solutions to one involve solutions to others. He too called climate change and abortion critical issues, and he suggested Catholics weigh what role a candidate can play on a particular issue in the political office they're seeking, and he used as an example President Trump's impact in withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Outside of bishops, a number of Catholic organizations have launched campaigns to raise the importance of climate change and environmental justice for voters. The Ignatian Solidarity Network, for instance, created the Voting is an Act of Love program. It encourages young people to register to vote, and as part of it, they created an ecology voting guide that highlights why addressing climate change is important from a Catholic perspective and policy issues that are important to the 2020 election. At one point it reads, "A Catholic response to climate change places care for creation and care for poor and vulnerable people who are most affected by climate change impacts at the center of its response." The Catholic Climate Covenant is also inviting Catholics to sign their Vote with Love in Action pledge. This is where Catholics can pledge to enact love and vote informed by the fullness of Catholic social teaching. You can sign up on their website. The Franciscan Action Network created a series of videos as part of its Vote Franciscan Values campaign, and one of those videos focuses on care for creation. We'll learn more about this campaign a little bit later. And finally, Interfaith Power and Light and Faith in Public Life, two interreligious organizations, have worked to mobilize people of faith to the polls through its Faith Climate Justice Voter Project. As part of it, they created a voter guide too, which tries to tie caring for God's creation to the U.S.'s responsibility as the historic leader in global greenhouse gas emissions to exercise moral and political leadership in moving toward a clean energy economy, honoring reductions targets under the Paris Agreement, and assisting developing nations to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Those are just some of the ways that Catholics are working to raise climate change as an issue in the 2020 elections. Next, we're going to hear directly from many voters just like you. Last month, I was able to speak with 7 young Christians from all across the country about the election, their vote, how climate change is factoring into it, and how their faith is informing that decision. Across the board, each of them drew on basic tenets of Christianity, including the obligation to care for creation. They also spoke of voting not just for themselves, but for others, including future generations. When it came to evaluating candidates, they were honest in recognizing that a candidate who aligns perfectly with their views doesn't exist. But they also said they look for someone who demonstrates in their actions the teachings of their faith and what Christ would do himself, especially when it comes to the poor and the marginalized. Let's hear from them now.
I see it as our last chance.
Pretty important. Definitely important.
I'm pretty scared.
Extremely important.
It feels like it's now or never, like it does feel like we're in the crisis zone.
It's a very critical time period. I think they have said that we have literally like 10 years left in order to fix ourselves.
If we have to wait another 4 years or even another year, it's definitely going to be too late to kick everything into gear.
Sky is orange in California. So much land is burning, and that's with 1 degree of warming. So if we don't get our act together in the next decade, we're going to see catastrophic climate consequences.
It is at the top. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like the number 1 issue because there are a lot of issues in 2020.
Pretty high. We have only about 10, 11 years before the climate crisis becomes too much to handle, and I think we have to start now. I know in the past 4 years, some of the environmental regulation has been lost, has been weakened, and I don't think that's where we need to be right now.
If you put it on a scale of 0 to 100, I would go to 110, because a lot of the issues that I know my community faced was mainly anthropogenic, right? And so it's because of chemical plants, industries.
Climate change and issues of racial justice are, I couldn't put them up like one above the other. I would say they're equally important to me, because you can't have climate justice without racial justice.
I think it's one of the more pressing issues, because if we don't make changes and quickly, there is going to be a lot of negative effects that come out of that.
Well, it's obviously top 5, I would say. It wouldn't be top like the 1 or 2.
Life and all that sustains it, so that includes climate change. So I would say it's one of the most important issues.
For me, whenever I look at candidates, I look at, do you demonstrate specific characteristics of walking like Christ?
It comes to that more conservative ideologies of, but not conservative as in Republican, but the original conservative ideologies of family, faith, stuff like that.
I think my faith tells me to choose what's best for others.
We have Laudato Si that has so many clear, specific policy points that the Pope wrote in there that we need to focus on for the environment, but then also for the poor and the vulnerable.
I'm thinking about the fact that I'm not just voting on behalf of myself, I'm voting on behalf of all future generations. And that weighs in super heavily into my vote, because I'm like, okay, what candidate will ensure the best future for the people that are going to come after me?
Oh, one thing. Oh, that's difficult. There's so many.
As much as possible.
The name of the game for me is 100% renewable energy, and also preserving our forests.
Just really doubling down on climate mitigation, reducing emissions in an equitable manner. I can't overstate this enough. Reducing emissions in an equitable manner.
From a community perspective, just really active policies that are consistently regulated.
It would be great to see like investment in green initiatives, so like the Green New Deal, preserving our natural resources.
But I think perhaps the most important is to move away from the use of fossil fuels for energy and move to more clean energy alternatives. And I think that is something that's doable, at least getting started on that within the next 4 years and making vast improvements to the infrastructure we currently have.
That's most important, is acknowledging the issue and realizing that we can't go back to what we were doing 10 years ago.
I'm a little nervous. Not a little, I'm very nervous. I'm worried. I know so much is at stake.
I feel extremely nervous.
I'm feeling hopeful.
I'm not feeling good about it, but we're Catholics, so I have to have hope, so I have to apply that hope to everything that I do.
I can't tell you that I'm worried or I'm concerned or I'm like really scared about this, because at the end of the day, like I feel like God is always in control.
If President Trump does win, he gets, or someone brings up to him that there's serious issues that need to be addressed. If Joe Biden wins, I think he already has his people already planning out what direction should be taken after that.
I tend to assume the worst, so that I don't get too surprised when the worst happens. So I also have a feeling of hopefulness that the right candidate will get elected.
This is where my faith comes into play. Having hope and having faith that things will change, that good will prevail, that we will do what we need to do as a species to save ourselves from a climate catastrophe. I just have to have faith.
For our last segment today, I sat down for an interview with Franciscan Fr Michael Lasky. He is the board chair of the Franciscan Action Network and chairman of the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Ministry for the Our Lady of the Angels province of the Franciscan Friars Conventual. Fr Mike explained why climate change and environmental issues are important for Catholics to consider in their vote. He also talked about what Franciscan Action Network is doing around the election and how young Catholics might approach their vote this year from a faith perspective. Welcome, Fr Mike.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. And I understand that you are currently in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yes, during this time of COVID, my wings have been clipped, if you will, for my other ministry. Most of it's moved online. So I've been asked to actually take up the pastorate of 2 parishes in central Pennsylvania, where we've been doing a lot of environmental and revitalization work here in Shamokin and Cole Township.
It's great. So I thought a good place for us to begin today was just speaking from a Franciscan perspective. Why are climate change and environmental issues important for Catholics to consider?
Okay, that's a powerful question. And I think that the question is more like, why should the environment be important when we actually stop to think about it? And I'd like to begin my answer with another question. When I say the word nature, what do you think of? Many people give me all kinds of answers whenever I ask this question. And it usually ranges somewhere between trees, mountains, beaches, and oceans. Rarely does anyone ever say me, or you, or a human being. So you see, we have so divorced ourselves from nature that I believe we're failing to recognize that fundamental for our dignity as human beings is that we are created. And then as such, we're part of a web of life. So it actually makes sense to me that we're having this conversation and asking these questions about environment and climate, because the reality is, I think too many people, too many Catholics don't see themselves as part of the web of life. They don't see the environment as important, not only in an election, but every day. Simply put, we vote our values, and the environment isn't a value for many. Yes, this is beginning to change, I believe, for younger generations, but sadly only to a point. We're nowhere near having it as part of our collective culture. There have been attempts, but they've largely been ignored, especially by American Catholics. It was about 40 some years ago that John Paul II called for Catholics to undergo an ecological conversion across the globe. And he chose St. Francis of Assisi, our Franciscan patron, as the universal patron for the church for ecology, to help us in this process of conversion. And decades later, little had changed, and Benedict XVI came along, and we nicknamed him the Green Pope, by the way. And he taught us that we have to see ourselves as one people, one planet. And here we see our interconnectedness in his teaching with one another, with nature, with God, in this web of life in which we live and move and have our being. Then comes along Pope Francis. With his writing of Laudato Si, he harkens back to St. Francis of Assisi, just like John Paul did. And St. Francis, in his calling humanity to conversion, which has echoed down through the centuries with concern for the poor and the outcast, and that perennial invitation of St. Francis for all of us to see water as our sister, fire as our brother, and our planet as our sister Mother Earth. Now, this isn't Franciscan feel-good poetry, as some people might say. This is 800 years of Franciscans listening to the cry of the planet and the cry of the poor, of our recognizing in our philosophy and in our theology that we are one people, one planet, and that we are connected.
Thank you for that answer. And from what I understand is the Franciscan Action Network is doing some things around the election. So could you talk a little about what is the Franciscan Family and Franciscan Action Network doing around issues of climate change and environmental justice ahead of this election?
So, Brian, the Franciscan Action Network, which we simply call FAN, is trying to fan the flame, if you will, of the Holy Spirit throughout this country. As the Franciscan family, we desire to bring our values into the public square. As part of this, FAN has recently rolled out our Vote Franciscan Values campaign, where we have invited people to watch and to listen and to vote with a Franciscan heart of compassion. This is not some superficial sympathy that we Franciscans ask for, but rather it's rooted in a mindfulness of the gospel and the teachings of the church, through which in this campaign, we filter our empathy for those whom Jesus commanded us to serve. A Franciscan heart, as we hear about in this video campaign, is code for, if you will, the heart of Jesus Christ, who came to humble the mighty, to lift up the lowly, to proclaim liberty to captives, and to feed the hungry good things. Remember that the founders of our country here in the United States saw religion as playing a vital role in forming the consciences of citizens, of those who vote. With that in mind, we turn to our Vote Franciscan Values campaign and these 3 videos. The first one focuses on the environment to help form consciences around this issue, giving voice to our sister, Mother Earth, and the many injustices that she suffers and endures. In this video, I state clearly, those who doubt climate change, fine. Don't believe in science of climate change, but believe in your relationship with creation, with nature. For this attitude can open up a space to allow us to be on the same page in seeking solutions to many of our environmental problems of today, the same page of faith and relationship and friendship that is the web of life. In another video, we focus on our sisters and brothers as immigrants who bear unnecessary and horrific crosses. Why? Simply because we've completely failed as a nation, both sides of the aisle, to find a path of comprehensive immigration reform. The final video of FAN deals with morality in politics. Brian, in our hyper-polarized world, FAN and Franciscans, we're saying enough.
You've certainly given us a lot to think about and to consider today. I appreciate that. I thought we might close with a final question. How might you advise young Catholics to approach issues of climate change, environmental justice, as they're weighing their vote from a faith perspective?
Well, as a Franciscan, I'd have to say simply with heart, with a heavy heart though. For each and every person that we vote for every issue that we find on a ballot, when we vote, we carry with us the heavy heart of the sufferings of so many who hope that our vote for the common good will bring the resurrection of Jesus to the crucified places of their lives. So my advice before filling out your ballot, ask yourselves one question. When I hear the word nature, what comes to mind? And if the answer is the web of life and how it suffers and how it could thrive, then you're ready to vote.
Well, thank you so much for all of the insights you've offered us today, and thank you for your time. It's been great to talk with you today.
You're welcome. Peace and goodness to you and to all who are listening.
So that wraps our time today. Hopefully, you found it informative and helpful in understanding why climate change is important to Catholics and how it relates to the upcoming election. Be sure to stay tuned to NCR and Earthbeat for our continuing coverage of the election and beyond. Thanks again for your time and for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your time at the Teach-In. Hope to see you guys next year.